I want to welcome Gregory Peterson to the podium, President of the Jackson Center. Greg.
Greetings. As the former Buffalo Bills head coach and also a member of the Hall of Fame, Marv Levy, would often say, where would you rather be than right here, right now? These are my sentiments exactly. I am the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center, as Scott mentioned, and we are a work in progress. We're less than 2 years old. An awful lot has been accomplished in a short period of time, and we're thrilled to be able to be here today. How appropriate it is that we are at the Elizabeth S. Lene Hall, located in the venerable and historic Chautauqua institution. Betty Lene, together with Carl Kappa, provided the vision and financial wherewithal to energize the concept, which is now known as the Robert H. Jackson Center. In addition, both were charter members. I'd like to introduce Betty Lene over here now, and Betty, if you please stand. And I want to say a gracious thank you. Is Kay here? Kay Kappa here? The man who put the wings of the Robert H. Jackson, put the wind under the wings of the Robert H. Jackson Center was Dan Bratton, who after retiring from a 16-year tenure as president of the Chautauqua institution at the end of 2000, found a passion within and gave vision to the Robert H. Jackson Center. Today, Chautauqua Institution, through the strong leadership of Scott McVeigh, has partnered with the Robert Jackson Center on a number of events, this being one of the foremost, which included a celebration last year with various prosecutors who were with Robert H. Jackson at the Nuremberg trial. We're excited about the prospects ahead between the Robert H. Jackson Center and Chautauqua Institution. Thanks to Scott and the staff, and especially Bruce Stanton and his crew, who put together an extraordinary turnaround here in order to make this facility as it looks today. So to the staff, I need to stop and applaud them. Thank you very much. Scott talked about the season at Chautauqua and the need for learning and the passion for learning that's Chautauqua. And I must tell you, the reason we're here today is to a piece of that serendipity, for it was last season during week 3 when I received a call from Kathy Crocker. Kathy Crocker works for the CLSC and advised me that there was a speaker named Erica Harth who was going to talk on her book, Last Witnesses, dealing with the Japanese American internment camp. I listened. She spoke about somebody named Korematsu, who in turn talked about, during the course of her conversation, a guy named Robert Jackson. So my antenna is really way up there at this point. Afterwards, of course, we engaged in conversation. Next day, we brought her down to the Robert Jackson Center. The next day, we interviewed Erica Harth, who spoke eloquently about the trials and tribulations of Fred Korematsu and Robert Jackson's involvement in that case, which then led to an internet search trying to ascertain the whereabouts of Fred Korematsu, which then led to finding just bear with me for a second, because it's really sort of a cute story. I got on the internet under Fred Korematsu, and if you type California, you won't find it. If you type Ken Korematsu, California, you won't find it. However, if you look strongly and hard, you'll see under a reference to Donald Haig, there was a reference to, and I got on the internet and I called. And there was a reference to the fact there's a voicemail that says, "Hello everybody, my name is Donald Haig and Karen and I are unavailable for a conversation if you leave a message." Well, this great English accent immediately tipped off the fact, because I'd read someplace that Karen, their daughter, was married to an Englishman. So I knew I was in the right place, right spot. So I left a long message explaining who I was. Karen graciously got back. Karen had a conversation with Fred Korematsu. You must know that Fred Korematsu and his wife don't travel much. You're here in a process of a very rare opportunity. And I can tell you on behalf of the Robert H. Jackson Center, I'm thrilled. And for all of you folks here, I think it's a testament to the fact that we're seeing a national treasure in our midst in Fred Korematsu, who has traveled here from California specifically to be here today, right now, with his wife of 54 years, Catherine Korematsu, and a very special person, Eric Fournier, who I'll introduce in just a second. Briefly, we are going to have the following program. I will be introducing Eric in a second. Then there will be a film, which at the time I entitled Of Civil Wrongs and Rights, the Fred Korematsu story. I can tell you that what I knew was the film was out there. What I did not know, that it had been nominated for an Emmy, and certainly did not know when we talked about this that on September 10th, 2002, the guy that I am going to introduce right now, Eric Fournier, won not one, but 2 Emmy Awards for the film that you are going to see shortly. Eric Fournier, a professional filmmaker since 1988, has produced and directed numerous television commercials and fashion and music videos. And as I understand it, currently in pre-production on his first feature-length fictional narrative film set to shoot in southern France and Spain, probably beginning right now. Next year? Okay. That's the benefit of winning an Emmy. All of a sudden, you have can take a deep breath. His biography is long, and I'm going to call Eric to come forward now. After the movie, I'll introduce John Barrett, and there'll be a wonderful conversation over here, which you will enjoy, which will include Catherine and Fred Fournier. Ladies and gentlemen, Emmy Award-winning Eric Fournier.
Well, first I'd like to thank all of you for coming here. I'd like to thank the Jackson Center and the Chautauqua Institute for having us as well. The film itself is very self-explanatory, so I won't say much, except that it's not the whole story. It's the tip of the iceberg. And earlier I heard mention of continuing education. When I started this film, I'm not a law professor. I'm not a professional researcher. I am not a legal scholar. The course of doing this film, I had to sort of broach all of those things. And I still continue to learn. The film's been finished for 2 years, and I learned something at lunch today about the case. And I'm looking forward to the post-discussion, and I hope all of you are as well. So with that, we'll see the movie. Thank you.
We expect the worst to happen, and it did. Curfew notices were posted on the telephone poles. And then after that, about a week or so, the notice for the evacuation.
I didn't think that the government would go as far as to include American citizens to be interned without a hearing. And then later on, they changed my draft card to 4C, which is enemy alien. In those days, if you're an Asian, people automatically think you don't belong in this country. You're not an American. And I thought that was wrong.
Fred Korematsu's case represented the trial that Japanese Americans never had. This was an entire population that, without evidence, without trial, without due process of any kind, were simply swept into internment camps, many losing their property, some even losing their lives.
The real significance of Fred's case is that it raised, for the first time, the central issue. Was the internment itself constitutional?
It was, I think, for him, a personal shock of recognition. Who am I? Am I an American? What does it mean for me to be an American?
If you look at Fred Korematsu, you see a very ordinary man who just wanted to be left alone, but who defied the United States government because he knew it was wrong.
In 1942, an ordinary American took an extraordinary stand. Fred Korematsu boldly opposed the forced internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. After being convicted for failing to report for relocation, Mr. Korematsu took his case all the way to the Supreme Court. The High Court ruled against him. But 39 years later, he had his conviction overturned in federal court, empowering tens of thousands of Japanese Americans and giving him what he said he wanted most of all, the chance to feel like an American once again.
December 7th, it was Sunday, and Sunday morning, around, gosh, it must have been about 10 o'clock, my girlfriend and I were up on Skyline Boulevard, looking down the Bay Area at the city and so forth. At that time, I was going around with a Caucasian girlfriend, and I liked her very much. And we had spread out the Sunday magazine, the Tribune, and just relaxed and had the music on, car radio, Sunday, nice sunny day, and of course we were talking mush. And, and all of a sudden this stopped. And they announced that Pearl Harbor was attacked. And I just couldn't believe it. You know, I thought it might be just a dream, but actually, the way they were explaining that bombs are flying here and there and people were getting shot at and so forth, and I said, wow. I said, this must be really going on. There's been so much friction between the United States and Japan, and the way Japan was so active going into China and doing all that, you know, invasion and so forth, that I had a feeling that, you know, they're just crazy enough to come down here. And that's what they did. At the nursery, my parents, they were all around the radio listening. They weren't saying very much. My mother was crying. My father was just disgusted. All that work that my parents did to that nursery and so forth, what's going to happen? A few days later, the police came down there and confiscated all the flashlights and cameras. They confiscated everything that they thought that we would use for signaling.
The policy to incarcerate persons of Japanese ancestry has a long history. For example, the earliest immigration law of 1790 stipulated that only free whites could become naturalized citizens. There was the 1913 and 1920 alien land laws that excluded persons of Japanese ancestry from owning land, as well as the 1924 immigration law, which excluded them from further immigration.
I was a welder at Moore Dry Dock, shipyard. I wanted to be in defense work, and I was doing so well that the superintendent said that he would like to advance me as foreman. And I thought that was real nice of him to do that. So Monday, when I went in to punch my time in, I find, instead of my time card, a note telling me to report to the union. Well, okay, so I went to the union. And there the agent approached me and told me, you cannot work in the shipyard. I felt that, you know, hey, I'm an American, and I'm here to help out in defense work. And I have nothing to do with Japan or any, so it's sort of an insult to me. So I went to the superintendent, and he says, I'm sorry, Fred, I can't help you. I did finally get another job, Golden Gate Ironworks in San Francisco. And that was owned by a German Jewish family. So they gave me a job on contract basis. And that's how I worked for him until Pearl Harbor.
Bombing of Pearl Harbor and the entrance of the U.S. into the war, a lot of people saw that as a perfect opportunity to get rid of persons of Japanese ancestry. They had a stereotype of being such hard workers and that they got their children involved in all of the work, and everybody in the family worked, and so therefore the cost of labor was lower, and therefore they could compete better in the economic market.
There were a lot of organizations that wanted internment, the agricultural interests in California, for example, because Japanese Americans had been so successful as farmers and competitors.
So when Pearl Harbor hit, now they could say it was, quote, military necessity, and therefore they could wholesalely exclude persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. There were a lot of persons, agricultural persons, the media persons, who were whipping up anti-Japanese sentiments. It took a few weeks before the media started getting into gear. But the Hearst papers in Seattle, Los Angeles, and San Francisco got started earlier.
General DeWitt was lieutenant general, about as high as they get, was the general in charge of the West Coast. There was some feeling that the West Coast might be invaded. He had recommended that the Japanese Americans be excluded from the West Coast so that they couldn't give secret tips to the invaders if the invaders ever came. That was sheer baloney, because there is no instance ever discovered in which any Japanese American on the West Coast ever did anything disloyal. It was pure foolishness.
Colonel Ben Detson, who was a government lawyer, wrote all of the arguments for the internment that General DeWitt presented to the War Department. Ben Detson, who was a lawyer trained at Stanford and who should have known something about the Constitution, simply said that because Japanese Americans belonged to an enemy race, their internment could be justified.
You see, before the war, my parents were very proud people. They always talked about Japan, you know, and also about the samurais and stuff like that. And right after Pearl Harbor, everything just, you know, they were just real quiet. They kept it to themselves. They were afraid to talk about that.
We had to have a bonfire in our backyard and burn everything that resembled Japan. Even if it was a picture of your uncle in Japan in a Japanese clothes, my mother burned everything. And even calendars, anything written in Japanese made you a suspect.
The Secret Service and the FBI had swept into the Japanese American community and had arrested any community leader, any teacher, any civic organization head of any importance in that community.
I thought the exclusion order would be only for aliens, those that were born in Japan. I didn't think that the government would go as far as to include American citizens.
If you have the Western Defense Command who was in charge of our movement, if they come at you with a bayonet in your back and say you're going to move into a horse stall, you do.
People that we thought were our friends, instead of helping us, they wanted to take things that they thought they could use themselves. That's because we couldn't take it with us. Well, I knew I couldn't take my girlfriend with me, so I decided maybe we should try to sneak out to Nevada to get away from this. I told my parents that I would like to leave. Well, I didn't tell them about my girlfriend. All I said, I wanted to leave. And they were so wrapped up on what they had to do before the evacuation. And I said, Fred, you're old enough to know what to do. And so you go ahead, and if you decide you want to do that, go ahead. So I did. One Sunday that my girlfriend and I, we were looking at the Sunday paper. She happened to notice a doctor showing about plastic surgery and how he changed the eyelids and so forth. And she says, hey, Fred, why don't you do this? And, you know, I had the feeling that the way she was dragging about going to Nevada, that she didn't want to go, see. So I said, well, if things get worse, you know, maybe something like this would help out. So I went to San Francisco, first chance I had, and I talked to this doctor. He would support.
He could publicly complain because the policy of internment had been decided on at the highest level by the president, and the country was at war. I think really the Supreme Court deserves to be criticized. Tell the truth.
These documents would start disappearing.
We were really able to make a statement as far as Asian American participation in the civil rights movement. This is a very important civil rights case, not just something that affects a certain group of people.
We read Korematsu versus the United States. Every law student has, and it's taught as a conflict of abstract principles: due process, equal protection, strict scrutiny, these kind of legalistic words. But at core was an immense human tragedy, the tragedy of a democratic institution that failed its own people. We felt that we needed to bring back the human element into our discussion. And the human element was represented by our own client, Fred Korematsu. We wanted him to have his day in court.
So we had this meeting, and Dale was explaining all the legal intricacies of the case. And we had a break during the meeting, and Fred took me aside, and he said, you know, these lawyers, they're awful young. And I said, Fred, these are the best lawyers around. I said, okay.
The lawyers on the legal team were mainly Japanese American. Bob Rusky and Peter Irons were not Japanese American, but most of the team were Japanese American, and very young lawyers, very idealistic young attorneys. And the question was, if you're going to reopen these monumental Supreme Court cases, do you know what you're doing? And I think there was a sense in the community that these lawyers better not lose Korematsu versus the United States for a second time.
It was very tempting to file with the U.S. Supreme Court because, in fact, that's where the real misconduct took place. And we would have gotten a lot of publicity asking the Supreme Court directly to reverse this decision. But as a matter of legal strategy, nobody had ever done that before. There was no precedent. We didn't even know under the rules whether it was possible. The court might spend months and throw our case out or send us back down to the lower courts. So we decided as a sort of conservative strategy that we'd start at the bottom and work our way up.
We thought about the advantages and disadvantages of each venue, each forum. We'd make a big splash in the Supreme Court, but we could also get kicked out really easily and really fast, given the composition of the Supreme Court at that time, which was quite conservative. We then hit upon the idea of filing in the 3 district courts where the men were convicted, because we'd have 3 bites of the apple. That meant we could lose 1, win 2, we could lose 2, win 1, and we would create such a conflict within the district courts that would create possibly the chance for an appeal in getting up to a higher court.
I received a copy of this document entitled A Petition for Writ of Coram Nobis, and I thought, well, that's very interesting. What is a writ of coram nobis? Studied this years ago in law school. I haven't seen one since or heard of one since.
Coram nobis is a Latin term. It simply means before us. An error has been committed before the court that needs to be reversed or overturned. It can only be used by a person who has already served their entire sentence, and it can only be used in a criminal case.
It was an unusual type of petition procedurally, and of course it was a daunting prospect of dealing with a case that had become a landmark case, albeit a dubious landmark case.
The petition itself was maybe a half an inch in length, but the documents, the copies that were attached, was about an inch. And the question was, how was the government going to refute these admissions of wrongdoing and cover-up and suppression being made by the government's own lawyers?
I really think they were adrift in the Department of Justice, and this is what we had heard. There were hawks and there were doves. There were people who wanted to just give in to the petition. There were people who wanted to fight the petition. As a result, they could not come to a coherent position. So, as they are wont to do at times of confusion, they just decided on a strategy of delay.
And after a period of 2 or 3 months with no response, the government then approached lead counsel Dale Manami and said, well, what about a pardon? Do you think Fred Korematsu would accept a pardon?
Well, of course, a pardon has a certain connotation to it. A pardon means that you have, presumably been justifiably convicted, and at least you're not challenging that conviction, that you did something that was wrong, but your government is willing to forgive you for it.
Lawyers have a duty to communicate offers of settlement to their client. And we brought it to Fred and Catherine, and her feeling was, it's Fred's position that the government should seek a pardon from him.
They had sort of hoisted themselves on their own petard as far as I was concerned, because having used all of this time to respond rather than responding on the merits, they proceeded, they approached it from the procedural angle. And so I talked to the parties in chambers about whether they wanted to go forward with a full-blown hearing, because I believe that, given the procedural posture of the case, it could be dealt with right then and there.
At that
Sort of an abbreviated version of what ultimately I would write, and gave a decision from the bench, and I think incorporated some of the language that ended up at the end of the opinion.
And she issued her ruling, in essence stating that there was sufficient evidence of governmental misconduct, of suppression of evidence, and that the policies of the American government were infected with racism.
It was a very, I think, from my perspective in the courtroom, a very eloquent statement about the Constitution. We need to protect the Constitution at all times for all people. And when she finished and just got up and left, walked out of the courtroom, the audience literally was stunned. They had just witnessed an unprecedented event, that this whole internment issue had been resolved by a court 40 years later in their favor.
I turned to Fred, and Fred looked at me and said, "What happened?" And I said, "Fred, you won. Your conviction's thrown out. You won." And Fred looked at me in a very subdued way. I think he was a little stunned, and he said, "That's good. That's really good."
And I just couldn't believe it. It took me quite a while before I actually sunk in that I have won.
Suddenly, people started bursting into tears. People were overcome with emotion. People came up and just literally enveloped Fred with, their arms. They wanted to shake his hand. They wanted to congratulate him.
The crowd came up to me and they put their arms around me and hugged me, and a lot of them were in tears.
I mean, I knew it meant a lot to the people who were there, that they were there to hear what was going to happen. But I don't think I was quite prepared for the response to it, because it really didn't seem to me there was a dry eye in the courtroom.
The significance of Korematsu
of Iraqis as a trade-off of POWs. And when you talk to members of Congress about that, they forget the fact that Iraqis living in the United States were here legally, that they were either American citizens or they were legal residents. But that seemed to make very little sense to them, or made very little difference to them, as it didn't in 1942.
2 years ago, I spoke at the University of Michigan, and they built a new library there, and we were going through there with the group of us, and all of a sudden there was another group, students came from the other end, about 15 of them, and they surrounded me and said, "Fred, we appreciate what you've been doing." And they gave me a certificate, and it was the Arab students of Michigan.
This is a country, as Lincoln put it, that was founded, dedicated to a certain proposition. And this proposition is the principle of equality. And Lincoln also said, included Robert.
I think there isn't very many jobs there in Salt Lake City. And in fact, in Salt Lake City, the place I was working for, there, we found out, the three of us I was working there, we found out that we were being paid half wages compared to the others. Okay. And so we got disgusted, and so we decided to leave. the boss said, well, you can't leave. Said, you got to work here. So we got you from Topaz. And said, if you're going to leave, we're going to send you back there. But I didn't even listen to that. I just went ahead. We're going to do something else. I did recap tires, so I learned how to recap tires. So
that's Detroit.
Yeah.
At least that.
Yeah.
And what was your thought when you heard that you'd lost in the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court had approved?
Yeah. Well, see, we've been corresponding all the time with Mr. Bessick,
right,
the ACLU attorney, and he told me that it was going into the Supreme Court. Now we got it, right. Because it's this Constitution. They're fighting the Constitution, and so I was waiting to hear from him, and all of a sudden he stopped writing for quite a while. So I finally wrote him, sent him a telegram, and asked, what happened, and he finally sent me a letter, and he just said he couldn't explain it, the reason why he lost. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't know why I lost, and neither did Mr. Bassick, I guess. Right. And what it was that we finally found out, from Peter Irons later on, after 40 years, that at that time you can go into government files for Freedom of Information Act that was passed. Mm-hmm. Until then, we couldn't have gone in.
Right. Before that, it's all sealed up.
Because it's sealed up, and you couldn't. The government won't let you look into their files. Well,
Catherine,
now that we found it, then it's it just dawned on us what happened. Right. The military lied about what was happening in the West Coast, that we weren't out of control there, and sending messages from ship to shore and so forth, and that was all.
Later you come to understand or conclude that the Supreme Court was tricked or was misled.
Yeah.
Before that, your conclusion was that the court had simply failed.
Yeah.
Now, Catherine, is Detroit where you've entered the picture? Mm-hmm. What was your reaction to the decision?
Well, you see, I didn't know Fred then, but I had become acquainted with some Japanese Americans that had been, relocated, so to speak. And one of them became a very good friend of mine. And then through her, I met a lot of other Japanese Americans. And we knew about Korematsu's case, and we knew he lost. Mm-hmm. But I didn't meet Fred for another probably 4 months later. I met Fred.
Okay. How did he first tell you, or how did you first ask, are you the Korematsu?
Oh, well, I knew that.
You did know that.
I knew that when I met him, because his brother had been in Detroit. In fact, that was one reason Fred was there at that time. His brother later went back to the West Coast. Well, the brother had a roommate. They lived at the Y. That was one place, that would allow people of different colors to stay. And so when the brother left, Fred's youngest brother, he became roommates with this fellow that I had met and had known for at least a year or so. And he had told this friend of mine, her name was Elma, that about Fred.
Right.
And so we knew that. We knew it through, there's a paper that the JACL, Japanese American Citizens League, published even then. I guess they had moved to Denver or someplace. And so this friend of mine was not a member, but she took it because that was the only way they knew what was going on in the community.
And
well,
that
of course,
was a
it was
good source.
slanted from the JCL viewpoint, but the papers, the regular newspapers and magazines ignored it. As far as I know, there probably was some publicity, but we've never seen it.
Okay. I'm glad you mentioned Fred's brother. I wanted to ask Fred, what were the consequences for the rest of your family? For your parents and the nursery that they had, and for your siblings?
Yeah, well, they evacuated the towpath. I mean, they all can go home after about, it was 4 years, I think it was. About 4 years.
Well, I think they had put it sometime January of 45, but it took a while for people to really, leave.
Right. And was there a home to go to?
Yes, there was. Yeah, we had a nursery. The banks took over it.
Okay.
And they leased it to a gardener while we were gone. So, in fact, the bank was the manager was a very good friend of my dad, so he made sure that.
So in your case, the property was not lost.
But no, the property wasn't lost, but the gardener that took over the nursery sold all the plants and never maintained it, so all the pipes were rusting, and they were you should paint the greenhouse, and he never did that, so it warped and all the glasses came off. So it was so they had to do the nursery completely over again.
Okay. How many siblings did you have, and what were their internment experiences?
Three.
Three brothers?
Yeah, three brothers. Two older than I and one younger.
Okay. I don't want to hog this. I get the feeling that there are probably some very good questions here. So if somebody would like to begin to break the ice, we can field some of that too. Yes.
Want to know how easy to get there? I don't know how Donahue does all this stuff.
Yeah.
What about reparations?
Reparations for the Japanese-American reparations?
Yes.
Well, Fred's case actually did not directly involve the Japanese-American reparations. Fred and Catherine were both asked by the reparations committee to take part, and they made the decision, I believe, at the time that they should first fight their case. Having fought that case and won it, they jumped in with both feet and helped it. And the Korematsu case is fairly well cited as being the underpinning that made Congress have to cave and allow reparations to happen. Prior to Korematsu versus the United States, the second decision, Congress always had, well, it's the law as a way of, holding back reparations. So while it wasn't directly connected, it had a large part to do with it. And Fred and Catherine were very involved.
There's something I think we should all know before we leave here, and one of them is we're all Japanese interned in the all Japanese in the United States interned.
Excuse me? Yes, the Issei, the first generation, were born in Japan. That's Fred's parents and that generation. And Fred is second generation. There might have been some third generations, but primarily those two. And there was a so-called window of opportunity before the actual incarceration of the group, that they could go inland, but very few of them did. First of all, you know, they had settled in California, Washington, Oregon, some in Arizona, and primarily, and as communities. And so the Midwest and the East were unknowns to them. And so many did not go voluntarily because, first of all, it took resources, and secondly, they needed some place to go. And so actually, most of them went into the internment camps. But also, the JACL, the Japanese American Citizens League, had a great influence on the people and told them that they were being very patriotic if they would just follow the government's orders. And that was the conflict between Fred and the people who defended him and the JACL.
I understood that in California, the Japanese were interned, but I don't recall that there was any effort by authorities to go throughout the United States and look for Japanese and intern them.
Well, there were very few Japanese Americans anywhere in the United States at that period, except on the West Coast and in Hawaii. The more curious thing is that where Pearl Harbor actually happened, the Japanese Americans were not interred.
They weren't. They had people there. They had a different military commander for that region. And also I don't know exactly the percentage of the population that were Japanese Americans, but a goodly number. And they knew that the economy there would suffer terribly if they were interned. And in Hawaii, there was, I can imagine there was some racism, but it wasn't so overt as it was on the West Coast. The people that were interned were in what they call the Western Military Command, which Lieutenant General DeWitt was the commander. And
he's quoted as saying a Jap is a Jap is a Jap. So,
yeah,
sort of sets the stage.
He had real racist tendencies, I would say, or maybe outrightly.
I wanted to ask Aaron how you came about making the movie. What motivated you?
Well, the idea to make the movie was Catherine Korematsu's idea, actually. Ken Korematsu, who refused to be interviewed for the film, Fred and Catherine's other child, is a very, very good, dear old friend of mine. And I guess it was the early 90s, Catherine called up Ken and said, why don't you make a movie about your dad? Other people are making movies about Gordon and Min. And Ken was working in advertising, and he talked to this woman, Shirley Nakow, who was also a friend of the family, who was an attorney. Neither one of them professional filmmakers. And they set about to make this film. Long story short, they realized it wasn't such an easy process, and Ken ultimately came to me, and we decided to make the film together. Since I'm a professional filmmaker, I sort of took the charge and led the way. You know, I've made a lot of films, I've made a lot of things, but this film is the closest thing that, you know, to my heart that which is why 2 years later we're still out here doing this. Every time I watch that movie, I see something else in it that's important today. So there are a lot of reasons to make the film. And I had a lot of very erudite people to interview, unlike I did. You know, I just had to point the camera and let them talk, and it worked out.
I hope you heard when it, I think it was Greg said he won an Emmy. He won 2 Emmys, one for producing, directing, and one for which he shared with someone else for editing. And editing is a very important part of movie making, which I've come to know, and or filmmaking, I should say. But this was Eric's idea. You notice there's not one just single narrator in the film. Some films, the narrator almost gets in the way of the message. This way, the people that are talking are the narrators. And this was you won't find many documentaries, or any that I know of, that I've seen like this. And so this was his idea. And then another Japanese-American woman who was a professional editor then sort of refined it. But that was Eric's, and she got an Oscar too, an Emmy too. But that was Eric's idea, and I think it's very clever. So he's a very clever filmmaker.
My question is for Mr. Korematsu. When Mr. Irons first showed you those papers with the evidence that had been suppressed by the government, what was your first reaction? Was it anger? Was it relief? Was it excitement? Was it sadness?
What did you think when you first saw the papers that Peter showed you? What did you think when you first saw the papers that Peter showed you?
You know, when Peter came to the house with those documents he showed you.
Oh.
Do you understand? What was your reaction?
Yeah. Well, to have him. Well, first when he called me from Boston that he would like to reopen the case, and it was quite a surprise to me, and you see, up to then there've been many people call me and want to know about my case and what my experience were and so forth right now at that time. And there's no one that would want to reopen the case for me. Well, here Peter Irons called me from Boston at that time, so I said, well, here's another person that just want to know about, or either he was writing a book or something about me. And, well, I said, I'm interested in reopening the case again, and I said, could you come down next week on Tuesday? He says, yes. I said, well, that's fine. Okay, I'll see you at my house at 7 o'clock, and I gave him my address. He lives in Boston, and, I'm way out in California. Well, so Tuesday came, and he was supposed to be at my door at 7 o'clock, just with my address. Coming from Boston to California and the West Coast there, and to my house at 7 o'clock, he said he'd do it. Well, there he was, 7 o'clock, knocked on the door.
It was a test. Fred didn't give him any directions.
Yeah, I didn't give any direction on how to get there, and there he was. And he had a beard and everything, and he looked, my goodness, he's distinguished, looked like, my goodness, Jesus was here. And the way he talked and everything,
my goodness, you know. And so finally I said, how did you find my house? He said, oh, I said, I know a friend of mine at Cal in Berkeley. That's right there, you know, about 15 miles away. And she said, she took me here to your house. She knew exactly how to get here. So by 7 o'clock, there he was.
Well, he was.
And I liked him and what he said and regard to that, you know, that he investigated in Washington from the Freedom of Information Act about what happened and so forth. And so, by God, I mean,
Fred might not
he's the man.
Fred might not remember. There's a quote that didn't make it into the film. I have over 200 hours of interviews that had to get distilled down to 1 hour. But Peter Irons says that after he showed Fred the papers, he sat there, Fred looked at him for a moment and said, they done me a great wrong. Just like that. So if you want to know how he felt, that probably says it. Oh, yes.
Hello, I'm up here in the back. Hello, Mr. Korematsu. Thank you for coming. We really appreciate it. I am a teacher, and I brought my class with me. And as an impressionable group of young people, and you were being described by so many as an activist, is there something you'd like to leave with them, or some message that you'd like to have them take away with them?
Yeah. I heard you. Yes, I would. And to believe on the Constitution, and also anything that's within rights. If you think you're right, and go along with it, and to fight it, you know, to not to give in. Like I did. I knew, you know, hey, it's against the Constitution what they're doing, and you know, even though, you know, like in here, you know, like I say, hey, what we're doing here is wrong, and I don't hear anything about the rest of them. So maybe they're right, you know, and I'm wrong, but I'm going to find out. So stick to your guns.
Mr. Korematsu, if the U.S. government had asked you to pardon them, would you have still continued with the case, or would you have pardoned the U.S. government for this error that they committed against you?
I didn't hear it.
Fred, would you have granted the government a pardon if they just said, we done you wrong, forgive us?
No. It's too deep of a problem. And it's something that's not pardon for me, it's a pardon for you too.
I see a question from the judge, so I must follow.
Well,
The judge.
I've got a question for each of you quickly. Mrs. Korematsu, how did your family feel about you marrying Mr. Korematsu? How did you, why did you decide to keep from your daughter the information for as long as it was? For Eric, was there any serious discussion or moves in the military or civilian circles about confining or curfewing people of Italian or German descent
during the war. And Mr. Korematsu, was there discussion in your camp among the Japanese Americans why Italian Americans and why German Americans were not treated the same way?
Well, Catherine, you want to go first?
Um,
Thank you, Judge.
I had a question for you too, Professor Barrett.
Catch me later.
Since this case stands as a precedent that it was not affected by the judge's decision in Mr. Korematsu's case, what could be done now about erasing that case from precedent in America, other than having someone of another American hyphenated descent accused in the same way and convicted the same way?
My understanding is that might be the only way. All right. Let's start with Catherine. Your family's reaction to this marriage, and then the protection of Karen from the story of her father's experience.
Well, my family didn't protest. I mean, they accepted Fred, and that may seem a little strange because I'm from Greenville, South Carolina, and that's where I grew up before I went to Detroit. So I went up there to finish my education. But I had grown up in a rather tolerant family. My mother and father were tolerant, although, you know, the blacks and the whites weren't equal. But they did not mistreat people. They treated them as persons. Not that my dad may have worked with some. My mother couldn't, she couldn't have them in her home. She did, but she ended up waiting on them instead of them helping her very much. So anyway, that was not a real problem. I had a couple of friends who didn't think that was a good idea, so they were no longer my friends. But let's see, another thing was...
And what about raising your children without the information about Fred's experience?
Well, you see, that's not unusual for the Japanese-American community, the Nisei, until actually Fred's case, Quorum Nobis case, came about and got all the nationwide publicity. They were very quiet. You know, some wondered what they were guilty of. Their thing was to just, you know, work, raise their families, and sort of not make waves. They brought their children up and educated them to be as Dale has said, 110% Americans, because they knew in their hearts they were Americans. There were very few people of Fred's generation that had even been to Japan. A few had. Some were sent back to go to Japanese schools, mostly to learn the language. And those people were called kibe. And some of those were able to help the government with translations and things like that. And of course, then there was the story of the 442 military unit, all Japanese Americans, distinguished fighting credentials in Europe, and much later, the story has come out that there were some of them that were interpreters and shortened the war because they were able to talk to prisoners and also find out information that would be helpful to the fighting, the military people.
On the cultural point, there's a term that's actually mentioned in the film, gamon, which is a Japanese traditional term which means to silently endure.
Yeah.
And it's something that, it's more than a word, it's a way of life that dates back to feudalism. And you don't complain. You don't cry about your lot in life. You go about your business and you do your work. Following the war, many were very much ashamed. It's actually similar to the kind of emotional response that a lot of Holocaust victims have. They often didn't talk about their experience to their children until much later on in the 60s and 70s after some of the things came out. So they just kept it to themselves, went about their business, and tried to ensure that this wouldn't happen to their children, that their children would be more American than American.
Yeah, well, as far as our daughter and son are concerned, I think Fred always had in mind, well, we talked about it between us, and he always was wishing he could, reopen his case, and never dreaming that it would finally happen. But he had a record as a criminal, you might say, not for not obeying the government, okay? Or the military, really. And by the way, it's frightening to think that the military was given all of that authority when you think back over it. All of that authority. There was no martial law, which is the one time that military authority is valid. So, but anyway, I think it'd be hard to explain this to your children. If you had robbed a bank or, something of that sort, that would be easy to explain. But how do you explain this whole internment to the children? And at that time, there was nothing really in the schools. The fact that our daughter learned about it in school is most unusual. There was this little book that came out about in the 60s called Concentration Camps USA, and I've forgotten the name of the author. I have it in paperback. One of my cousins in South Carolina found it in a used bookstore or something and sent it to me. And until then, I hadn't seen it, but the teacher of the social studies class gave it to this other girl who was Japanese American, full Japanese American. And I think he probably didn't even realize that Karen was Japanese American, although she has some Asian, looks somewhat Asian. I know a lot of her schoolmates thought she was Polynesian, and so it's just, I know it's hard for you to understand. You'd think that you'd be talking about it all the time. But, we were busy bringing up our children and trying to see that they were well-educated and good citizens. And we did a lot of community things, working in the community. And so we were sort of busy, and that's probably another reason. But we've only had this outpouring of people telling their stories in the last 10 years, really. It took a while. And there are many Japanese American women who were interned who are very reluctant to talk about it. So it was a painful time.
There's another thing, too. After they left the relocation center, or I call it concentration camp.
It is.
It's a fair name.
It was.
They went back, and whatever they can do to get back into life again, they struggled and so forth, and some went back into business all over again, starting all over again, and some lost. They used to grow strawberries. In fact, strawberries were scarce after they were all Japanese were interned, because they were the only ones growing strawberries in California.
It was stoop labor, and they were willing to do it.
So, but they struggled, and they finally, a lot of them, the majority of them became successful in business again. They had big farms and big, and nurseries and so forth. And so when I decided I want to open up my case again in '83, well, I started hearing all kinds of noises hey, Fred, why don't you leave it alone? It happened 40 years ago, you know. It won't happen again. And that kind of noise has been going around on me. So, you know, I had a little difficult time continuing on my case because even the Japanese people were against me to reopen it again.
Just another funny aside. His daughter finds out. They finally tell her what it's all about. Ken Korematsu is 4 years younger. He doesn't find out until he gets the same social studies teacher 4 years later. He comes home and says, Dad, who's this Fred Korematsu guy? So, you know.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. We thought, we don't remember that he wasn't in on the discussion. But that's it, Fred. I think there was publicity that Fred, in the papers, and it's quoting our daughter and so forth. And she said to me, you know, I don't know if I feel comfortable telling people about, you know, giving an interview. It was a phone interview, because she says people always ask, well, what did your father say? And she said, he didn't really say much. And that's it. Fred is, you know, he's not one. He's a great person. He's friendly. He's kind. He's kind. He's honest and all of that. But he doesn't go out of his way to tell people his problems. You know.
In the start, and when I opened my case up, when I went to court, and I finally won. And after that, I've talked to quite a few people on the outside. They didn't know anything about that, what happened. I said, you didn't know that there was an intent? No, see, because they've been traveling, or else they've been going from one job to another. So I don't know. But I said, my God, I said, you know, the people have to know about this. So every time I get invited to universities to talk to law students, I did. And so I spoke to Cornell and Yale and Harvard and so forth. And I've been all over. And at first I was kind of nervous, you know, when I get out. But now I enjoy it because that even the people that I speak to are the kind that, you know, well educated and so forth, or being going to be an attorney. So, I mean, I was. I'm not sorry that I'm still, you know, I'm still doing it if I can.
Right, Fred. What do you say to people? I assume no one. I've certainly not run into anyone who today will defend the government's conduct with regard to Japanese Americans. But what do you say to people who say that's a thing unto itself? It's a World War II era atrocity that's a piece of history, tragic but past, and it doesn't relate to current issues.
Oh, I think it's not all that. It's a racial issue too. You know, it's at that time it was, you know, Japanese or anybody with a slant eyes or Oriental, they were after that. See, they were hating that. So it was a racial thing. And it even was in the papers. Even one of the biggest papers in San Francisco, the San Francisco Examiner, a few years ago, apologized for the racial slur they used to put in the papers during that time.
Clear by current events that this is not an issue that was isolated just at one time with war.
So that even is happening now is a racial thing on the Arabs, you see. And so we got to watch that. You can't just blame the country. Now it's a racial thing.
Yeah,
people with an Arab, with a, what do you call that?
Now, those aren't Arabs. They're
well, even at that, you know, you got to be careful.
questions?
Well, the judge.
Yes.
Is he still? The opinion is still there, but as Judge Patel says, and Peter too, it's been discredited, and Judge Patel thinks that it would be very difficult to use this as a precedent. Not that there haven't been rumblings about that. There was one member of the Civil Rights Commission who said, well, you know, we may have to put the Arabs in camps. And of course, that's one thing about now the JCL, they will speak up. And the Japanese American community and the people who've been interned, they always say they don't want this to happen to anybody else. And so they're very vocal. We have a lot of Muslims of different nationalities. We have an Afghan community. We have a Iraqi community, and the Sikhs, and there's a lot of Hindus and so forth. And so whenever there's anything in the news, right away, the Japanese American community, they're more organizations, but they always speak out. In fact, Fred's Quorum Nobis attorneys wrote a letter to the chairman of the Civil Rights Commission, protesting and saying they didn't think that they would like to see this fellow removed because that was going to be his thing. And then, of course, he backed down. But I think it could have happened to, especially on the West Coast, because I don't know. That's sort of like, you know, it's good climate, and a lot of the people from different countries, you know, live there because they like it, and by and large are accepted. But there would have been a big hue and cry if they had tried to put any of the Arab Americans in camps.
Now, can I ask one question, which I think may paraphrase what Dorosky had asked? When you were in the camp, obviously there were just Japanese Americans in the camp. Yet we were at war with the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese. Was there any discussion in the camp of why just us?
I'm not sure they even knew about that. We do now, we know that. But the Italians, some of them had to move from, if they lived near, there was a place called Port Chicago, which was an ammunition area. And they had to move inland or away from there, or they were told to, and I guess they wanted to intern the Italians in San Francisco, because there's a big Italian community there, and was at that time. And they said, no, you're not going to do this to us, and they backed down. But anybody that was a German American or an Italian American that was in that area, or in any area of the United States, they were given a personal hearing. This is what the masses of Japanese Americans did not get. Fred got his hearing, and so did Gordon and a few others.
Because they forced the issue in the 1980s.
No, in even, yeah, but no, it was only people who really were very suspect, and they were probably loyal, but they were put in camps. There were those were called FBI camps. They were not the same. They were concentration camps, okay, but they were called FBI camps.
Yeah, there was no internment, mass internment of
there wasn't.
German or Italian Americans. There was one concentration camp or internment camp, but it was for some Italian American, not Italian Americans, Italian nationals that happened to be merchant marines after war was declared. Their boat just happened to be in harbor in New York. And their place was in Montana. It was like a country club. Very different experience.
Well, I can tell you that the internment camps were not a country club.
You have been witness to an extraordinary conversation. Last summer, the summer of 2001, we had a week devoted to the phenomenon of heroism. The first speaker that week was a classic scholar from Princeton University, S. Georgia Nugent. She described the Greek hero. She said to be a Greek hero required these ingredients. 1, you had to be a male. 2, you had to kill a lot of people. 3, you had to get killed yourself. And 4, there had to be a storyteller around to tell your story. And then you gain immortality. And in the Q&A, this is a startling revelation to really think about this for a moment. She was pressed very hard as to who her heroes were today. And she said, oh, the quotidian hero, the everyday hero. You know, Rosa Parks, Fred Korematsu. Thank you.